Homeless cat finds shelter with kind farmer. Their bond becomes unbreakable. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of freshly tilled earth and morning dew. A faint orange glow spread across the horizon, signaling the start of another day in the quiet countryside. For most people, the scene was idyllic. Rows of golden crops swaying gently, a distant hum of birdsong, and the faint chatter of farm animals waking with the sun. But for one small creature, the morning was just another chapter in a story of struggle and survival. The cat, a scruffy ball of orange fur, crouched low near a dilapidated wooden fence. Her ribs were visible through her matted coat, evidence of weeks, or maybe months, spent scavenging for food. Her amber eyes darted around cautiously, scanning for movement. In a place where predators lurked and food was scarce, she had learned to be wary of everything. A rumble of tires broke the morning stillness, and the cat froze. The sound grew louder until an old, blue pickup truck appeared at the end of the dirt road. It kicked up a cloud of dust as it ambled toward the farmhouse, its engine groaning with age. Inside sat a man, his large, weathered hands gripping the wheel. Henry Thompson was a man of few words. A farmer through and through, his life was one of routine. Tending the fields, caring for the animals, and keeping his head down. Widowed for over a decade, Henry had grown accustomed to solitude, his only companions being the cows in the barn and the chickens in the coop. He liked it that way, or at least he thought he did. As Henry parked the truck and stepped out, the cat shrank back, disappearing into the shadows of the fence. She watched him carefully as he unloaded bags of feed, the effort visible in his movements. He was an older man, his graying beard and calloused hands a testament to years of hard work under the sun. Henry didn't notice the cat at first. His focus was on the chores ahead, the long day of labor stretching before him. The cat's stomach growled, a sharp pang of hunger tearing through her frail body. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten anything of substance. Her days were spent nibbling on scraps or hunting for rodents, neither of which were abundant on the outskirts of the farm. The scent of food wafted toward her from the back of Henry's truck, and she couldn't resist creeping closer. Henry was midway through carrying a heavy sack of grain into the barn when he heard the sound. A faint, almost imperceptible mew. He paused, setting the bag down, and looked around. First, he saw nothing. The morning was still, the field silent except for the rustling of leaves. He wiped a hand across his brow and shook his head, convinced he was imagining things. But then he heard it again, a small, pleading mew. Henry turned, and there, near the back of his truck, was the cat. She stood hesitantly, her tail low, her eyes fixed on the bag of grain as though it held the answer to all her problems. For a long moment, man and cat simply stared at each other. "What in the world are you doing here?" Henry muttered, his voice gravelly from years of disuse. He crouched slightly, squinting at the feline. The cat flinched, ready to bolt, but her hunger kept her feet planted. She stayed frozen as Henry took a cautious step closer. "You're a scrawny thing," he said, his tone softening. Henry's eyes, though hardened by years of loss and solitude, held a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps even compassion. He noticed her trembling frame, the way her sides heaved with exhaustion. It wasn't the first time Henry had come across a stray animal on his land. Dogs had wandered in over the years, and even a fox or two had tried their luck in the chicken coop. But there was something about this cat that struck him as different. "Stay put," he mumbled, raising a hand as though the cat might understand his words. Henry turned toward the barn and disappeared inside. Moments later, he returned with a shallow bowl and a small tin. The cat's ears perked up as the faint smell of food filled the air. Henry knelt near the fence, placing the bowl gently on the ground. He cracked open the tin of tuna and emptied it into the bowl. "There you go," he said quietly, standing back up and dusting his hands. The cat didn't move at first, her eyes darting between Henry and the food. Suspicion outweighed desperation. She had learned not to trust humans, for they often meant harm. but the hunger was too strong. Inch by inch, she crept toward the bowl, her nose twitching as she inhaled the scent. Henry watched from a few paces away, making no move to frighten her. He simply stood with his hands on his hips, observing. The cat finally reached the bowl and began to eat. Each bite hurried, as though she feared the food might vanish. Henry sighed, shaking his head. "You're welcome," he muttered, turning back toward the barn. "Don't get too comfortable." Over the next few days, the cat remained near the fence line, always keeping her distance but never straying far. Henry noticed her lingering presence as he went about his work, her small figure often silhouetted against the golden fields. Each morning, he'd leave a small dish of food near the barn, and each morning, it would be empty when he returned. The cat never came too close, but she was always there, watching. "Persistent little thing," Henry said one evening as he leaned against his truck, gazing toward the fence where the cat sat, her tail wrapped neatly around her paws. The sun was setting behind her, casting a warm glow across the land. Henry chuckled softly, though the sound was foreign to his ears. It had been years since he'd laughed at anything, let alone the antics of a stray cat. As the days turned to weeks, the cat grew bolder. Slowly but surely, she began venturing closer to the farmhouse, exploring the edges of Henry's world. She no longer darted away when he appeared, though she remained cautious. Henry found himself talking to her more often, muttering observations as he worked. "Looks like you're filling out a bit," he said one morning as the cat lounged near the barn, grooming her now clean fur. "Guess the food's agreeing with you." The cat glanced up, her amber eyes meeting his for a brief moment before she resumed her task. Henry shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was on a particularly cold morning that everything changed. Henry had been up before dawn, hauling supplies from the barn to the main house when he noticed the cat curled up on the porch. She was tucked against the corner, her fur fluffed for warmth, but she was shivering. Henry paused, his brow furrowing. "Now what are you doing out here?" he said, more to himself than to her. The cat opened one eye but didn't move. Henry sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He turned and opened the farmhouse door, the hinges creaking loudly. Without saying another word, he disappeared inside. A moment later, Henry reappeared holding an old blanket. He spread it out on the porch, careful to leave plenty of space between him and the cat. "There," he said, gesturing toward the makeshift bed. "Better than freezing, isn't it?" The cat watched him carefully but didn't move. Henry shrugged and turned back toward the barn, muttering under his breath. By the time he returned, the cat was curled up on the blanket, her body relaxed for the first time in weeks. Henry stopped in his tracks, his expression softening. "About time," he said quietly, a strange warmth spreading in his chest. From that moment on, the cat became a fixture on the farm. She spent her days following Henry at a distance, watching as he worked. She claimed the porch as her own, sleeping soundly on her blanket each night. Slowly but surely, the invisible barrier between man and cat began to fade. Henry found himself talking to her more often, sharing thoughts and observations as though she were an old friend. "You know, I never planned on keeping a cat," he said one afternoon as he mended a fence. The cat sat nearby, her tail flicking lazily. "But I suppose you've got a knack for sticking around." The cat purred softly, her eyes half closed as she basked in the afternoon sun. Henry chuckled, the sound rich and genuine. Over time, the bond between Henry and the cat grew unbreakable. She became his shadow, accompanying him on his daily chores and greeting him at the porch each morning. Henry, who had spent years in silence and solitude, found comfort in her quiet companionship. The farm, once a place of routine and emptiness, felt alive again. What neither of them knew was that their chance meeting would change both of their lives forever. Days turned into weeks, and the orange cat, whom Henry had started calling Pumpkin because of her rich golden coat, became an inseparable part of his life. He hadn't made a formal decision to keep her, nor had he announced it to anyone. There was no need to. It was an unspoken agreement between them. Pumpkin would stay, and Henry would look out for her. That was enough. Pumpkin's confidence grew steadily. She now roamed the farm freely, climbing hay bales in the barn, slipping between fence posts, and lounging in patches of sunlight near the house. At first, Henry grumbled about her habit of darting between his legs while he worked, especially when she tripped him while he carried feed or tools. "Pumpkin, you're going to break my hip one of these days," he scolded, though his tone was gentle. "I'm too old for your nonsense." Pumpkin would only blink at him, unbothered, before leaping to a new perch. It was as though she knew she had earned her place here. One particularly cold morning, Henry awoke to the sound of Pumpkin scratching at the front door. The frost had come early this year, and Henry was reminded of the first day he'd seen her, thin, shivering, and desperate. Without hesitation, he opened the door, and Pumpkin padded inside as though she'd always belonged there. "Well, I guess we're past formalities," Henry muttered, watching her make herself comfortable on the old rug near the fireplace. He chuckled softly and tossed another log onto the flames. The warmth of the fire crackled and filled the room, and for the first time in years, the house felt less empty. Pumpkin was no longer just a stray cat Henry fed out of pity. She was family. As the weeks went by, Henry began to notice just how much her presence had changed him. The loneliness that had hung over his life since his wife passed away had slowly lifted, replaced by the simple joys of Pumpkin's companionship. Henry found himself talking to her more than ever, telling stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "You'd have liked her," he said one evening, his voice soft as he stared into the flames. Pumpkin was curled up on the armrest of his recliner, her head resting on her paws. "Mary always loved cats. She'd bring home strays whenever she could. Drove me crazy back then," he chuckled, shaking his head. "I never thought I'd miss it so much." Pumpkin's tail twitched in response, though she remained otherwise still. Henry smiled faintly, lost in memory. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself to reminisce about Mary. The farmhouse had been silent for too long, and somehow, Pumpkin had brought back its voice. Winter deepened, and with it came bitter winds and heavy snow. Henry worked tirelessly to keep the animals warm and the farm running, though the cold seeped into his bones more than it used to. Pumpkin stayed close by, following him into the barn and curling up on the hay while he worked. One evening, as Henry shoveled snow off the porch, he noticed Pumpkin staring intently toward the far edge of the property. Her ears were perked, her gaze fixed on something unseen. Henry followed her line of sight, squinting into the twilight. "What's got your attention, girl?" he muttered, wiping his brow despite the cold. First, he saw nothing. The fields were covered in a thick blanket of snow, untouched except for the faint trails left by Pumpkin and the occasional rabbit. But then Henry noticed movement, a dark shape emerging from the tree-line. His heart leapt into his throat. A dog. The animal was large, its fur matted and its body gaunt. It stumbled forward, its legs unsteady as though it had been walking for days. Henry froze, watching as the dog limped closer. Pumpkin remained perfectly still, her golden eyes following the stranger with sharp precision. "Poor thing," Henry murmured. He dropped his shovel and stepped cautiously off the porch. The dog noticed him and stopped, its head lowering warily. Henry raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog hesitated, its dark eyes reflecting exhaustion and fear. It was clear that it had been on its own for a long time, much like Pumpkin had been when she first arrived. Henry's heart softened as he remembered that day. The look of desperation in Pumpkin's gaze, the quiet plea for help. "You're not the first stray to wander here," Henry said softly, inching closer. "And something tells me you won't be the last." The dog remained rooted to the spot, its thin legs trembling. Henry sighed and turned back toward the porch, knowing better than to push his luck. "Suit yourself," he called over his shoulder. "I'll leave some food out if you change your mind." As he reached the porch, Henry glanced back and noticed Pumpkin had moved. She was now sitting near the edge of the snow-covered yard, watching the dog intently. For a brief moment, the two animals seemed to communicate silently, two strays who understood one another's plight. Henry shook his head, smiling faintly. "Looks like you've made a friend, Pumpkin." The next morning, the food Henry had left out was gone. The dog was nowhere in sight, but Henry noticed faint tracks in the snow leading back toward the woods. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. The food would disappear overnight, and the tracks would reappear in the morning. Pumpkin seemed unfazed by their new visitor. She often perched by the window, watching the yard as though waiting for the dog's return. Henry found himself doing the same, peeking out the window each morning to see if the tracks had returned. Finally, after nearly a week, the dog reappeared. Henry spotted it near the barn, sniffing cautiously at the bowl of food he'd left out. This time, the animal looked slightly stronger, its steps more sure. Henry didn't approach. It was clear the dog needed time to trust him. But Pumpkin had other ideas. To Henry's surprise, she slipped out of the house and padded toward the barn, her tail swishing lazily. "Pumpkin, what are you doing?" Henry called, hurrying after her. The dog tensed as Pumpkin approached, its ears flattening. Henry froze, ready to intervene, but Pumpkin moved slowly, her demeanor calm and non-threatening. She stopped a few feet away from the dog and sat down, her amber eyes steady and unblinking. For a long moment, neither animal moved. Then, as though reaching some silent agreement, the dog relaxed. It lowered its head and continued eating, ignoring Pumpkin's presence entirely. Henry watched in disbelief. "Well, he muttered, shaking his head. "You've got a knack for this, don't you?" From that day forward, the dog returned regularly, each time venturing a little closer to the house. Henry began leaving blankets in the barn, creating a warm space for their visitor. He still hadn't been able to get close to the dog, but he didn't mind. It would take time. Henry knew that better than anyone. Pumpkin, however, had no such reservations. She seemed to have adopted the dog as her own, often following it around the yard or curling up nearby while it ate. Henry marveled at the bond forming between them, a quiet understanding built on trust and patience. "You're a good girl, Pumpkin," Henry said one evening as she curled up in his lap by the fire. "Better than I deserve." Pumpkin purred softly, her eyes half closed as she drifted off to sleep. Henry stroked her fur, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. He glanced toward the window, where he could just make out the faint outline of the dog resting in the barn. For the first time in a long time, Henry's farm didn't feel empty. It felt like home. As the days turned into weeks, Henry's bond with Pumpkin and the stray dog deepened in ways he hadn't expected. The farm, which had once felt vast and silent, was now alive with new routines. Every morning, Henry would open the barn doors to find the dog resting on the blankets he'd provided. Pumpkin would often be curled up nearby, as though keeping watch. It was an unusual sight, this small golden cat and the large, scruffy dog, but Henry found it comforting. The dog still wouldn't let Henry get too close, though its behavior had softened. It no longer flinched when Henry appeared, and sometimes it would follow him at a distance as he worked. Pumpkin seemed to serve as a bridge between them, her calm demeanor reassuring the dog that Henry could be trusted. Henry had started calling the dog Bear because of its size and shaggy fur. "You're a stubborn one, Bear," Henry would say, shaking his head as the dog cautiously ate from its bowl. "But you're a survivor, I'll give you that." It wasn't lost on Henry how much he related to the stray animals. He too had been surviving, alone, withdrawn, and stuck in his ways. But Pumpkin and Bear were changing that. They had forced him to look outside himself, to care for something again, and it gave him purpose. Winter lingered longer than usual that year, blanketing the farm in snow and ice. Henry's work grew harder as the temperatures dropped, and there were days when his back ached so badly that he could barely move. He had grown old alone, and the years were starting to catch up with him. One particularly frigid morning, Henry noticed Pumpkin scratching anxiously at the front door. It wasn't like her to be so restless. "What's the matter, girl?" Henry asked, opening the door to let her out. Pumpkin darted into the snow without hesitation, her golden fur stark against the white landscape. Henry frowned, watching her run toward the barn. Something was wrong. He grabbed his coat and boots and hurried after her, his breath turning to mist in the freezing air. As he approached the barn, he heard a faint sound that made his heart stop. A low, pained whine. "Bear?" Henry called out, his voice laced with worry. He found the dog lying near the entrance of the barn, its body shivering violently. Bear's fur was matted with snow, and his breathing was shallow. Henry dropped to his knees, his hands hovering uncertainly. "Oh no, no, no," he muttered. "What happened to you, boy?" Pumpkin was sitting nearby, watching anxiously. It was as though she had known Bear was in trouble and had fetched Henry for help. "Smart girl," Henry murmured before turning his attention back to the dog. "Hang in there, Bear. I've got you." Despite the sharp protests from his back, Henry carefully lifted the dog into his arms. Bear was heavy, but Henry didn't stop. He carried him into the house, laying him down gently on a blanket near the fireplace. Pumpkin followed close behind, her tail swishing nervously. Henry worked quickly, drying Bear's fur with a towel and wrapping him in more blankets. The dog's eyes fluttered open briefly, his gaze meeting Henry's. "You're not going anywhere, you hear me?" Henry said firmly, though his voice shook with emotion. "Not after you've come this far." Over the next few days, Henry nursed Bear back to health. He made broth to keep him hydrated, sat with him by the fire, and spoke to him in a low, soothing voice. Pumpkin never left Bear's side, curling up next to him as though willing him to recover. "It's funny," Henry mused one evening, staring into the fire. "I spent years thinking I didn't need anyone. I thought being alone was easier." He glanced at Pumpkin, who was perched protectively next to Bear. "Then you two came along and proved me wrong." Bear's recovery was slow, but steady. Each day, he grew a little stronger, his eyes brighter and his movements surer. One morning, as Henry sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee, he heard the familiar sound of paws padding across the floor. He looked up to see Bear standing in the doorway, his tail wagging softly. "Well, I'll be," Henry said, a smile spreading across his face. "You're up." Bear walked over and sat at Henry's feet, looking up at him with gratitude in his dark eyes. Henry reached down hesitantly, half expecting the dog to pull away. But to his surprise, Bear stayed still, allowing Henry to scratch gently behind his ears. "There we go," Henry said softly. "Took you long enough." From that day on, Bear became a permanent fixture in Henry's life. The once suspicious dog now followed Henry everywhere, into the fields, to the barn, and even into town when Henry made trips to the supply store. Pumpkin, of course, remained Bear's constant companion, the two of them often napping together in patches of sunlight or exploring the farm as a team. Henry's neighbors began to take notice. They hadn't seen Henry this happy in years. "Those animals have done you good, Henry," one neighbor remarked, watching Bear trot loyally beside him. Henry chuckled, glancing down at the dog and cat who had become his family. "They saved me," he said simply. Spring eventually arrived, melting away the snow and bringing new life to the farm. Henry spent long days planting seeds, repairing fences, and tending to the animals. Bear and Pumpkin were always nearby, their presence a quiet reminder of how far they had all come. One afternoon, as Henry rested on the porch, he looked out over the fields and smiled. The farm was still the same place it had always been, but it felt different now. It felt alive, warm, and full of hope. Bear lay at Henry's feet, his head resting on his paws. Pumpkin was perched on the railing, her tail flicking lazily. Henry reached down and scratched Bear behind the ears, earning a contented sigh from the dog. "You two showed up when I needed you most," Henry said, his voice soft. "And I didn't even know it." Pumpkin purred in response, and Bear wagged his tail, as though they understood every word. Henry leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes and breathing in the fresh spring air. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He had his farm, his memories, and his two loyal companions. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was a life he was grateful for. A life filled with second chances. As the weeks rolled on, the bond between Henry, Bear, and Pumpkin grew even stronger. The three of them had become inseparable. The farm, once quiet and heavy with loneliness, now seemed to buzz with a new kind of energy, one born of love and connection. Neighbors who had long given up hope on the reclusive old farmer now smiled and waved when they passed by, noticing the change in Henry. Every morning, Bear and Pumpkin would wake Henry by nudging him with their noses. The gentle touch was a far cry from the solitary mornings Henry used to spend staring into his coffee cup, unsure how to fill his time. Now, his days were full, and he greeted each one with newfound enthusiasm. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the fields, Henry decided it was time for something new. "Come on, you two," he called to Bear and Pumpkin as they bounded after him. "Let's fix up that old barn." The barn had fallen into disrepair over the years, the paint peeling and the wood groaning under its age. Henry had avoided it, much like he had avoided so many other things in his life. It reminded him of the past, of dreams he had long let go. But with Bear and Pumpkin by his side, he felt a spark of motivation. As Henry hammered and painted, Bear stayed close, sitting patiently in the grass and watching his every move. Pumpkin, meanwhile, prowled the edges of the barn, chasing bugs and leaves as though she were a kitten again. Henry couldn't help but laugh at the sight. "You two are good company," he said aloud, as if they could understand. And in some ways, he felt they did. As the days passed, the barn began to take shape. Henry fixed the broken doors, patched up the roof, and gave it a fresh coat of paint. By the time he was finished, it looked almost as good as new. He stood back, hands on his hips, and admired his work. "What do you think, Bear?" Henry asked, looking down at the dog. Bear barked softly in response, his tail wagging as though to say, "Good job." Henry chuckled and reached down to scratch the dog's head. "Yeah, I think so too." The barn became a symbol of Henry's newfound purpose. It was no longer a place he avoided. It was a place of hope, of new beginnings. And every evening, Henry would sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the barn with Bear and Pumpkin by his side. One evening, as Henry rested in his chair, he noticed a car pulling up the long dirt driveway. It wasn't often that Henry had visitors, so he squinted into the distance, trying to see who it might be. As the car drew closer, Henry's heart skipped a beat. It was his nephew, Michael, whom he hadn't seen in years. Henry stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. Bear and Pumpkin perked up, their curiosity piqued. "Uncle Henry?" Michael called out as he stepped out of the car. "Michael?" Henry replied, his voice filled with surprise. Michael smiled and walked toward him, extending a hand. "It's been a long time." Henry shook his hand firmly, though his voice caught in his throat. "It has. What brings you out here?" Michael glanced around, taking in the farm. "I heard you were doing well. Some of the neighbors told me about the changes you've made, how you've been fixing the place up. I thought I'd come and see it for myself." Henry's chest swelled with pride. He hadn't realized how much the farm had changed until he saw it through Michael's eyes. The once faded barn stood tall and strong. The fields were thriving, and the house, though still old, seemed to radiate a newfound warmth. Michael's eyes fell on Bear and Pumpkin, who were standing protectively near Henry. "And these must be your companions," Michael said, crouching down to pet them. Bear wagged his tail, and Pumpkin, though wary at first, allowed Michael to scratch her ears. "Yeah," Henry said, his voice soft. "They've been good to me." Michael looked up at his uncle, a hint of admiration in his gaze. "You know, Uncle Henry, I was worried about you for a long time. After Aunt Margaret passed, it seemed like you shut yourself off from the world." Henry nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Bear and Pumpkin. "I did," he admitted. "I thought being alone was easier. But these two, well, they reminded me that life doesn't stop just because you're hurting." Michael smiled and stood up. "I'm glad to see you found some joy again." Henry looked out over the farm, the setting sun casting everything in a golden glow. "It's funny," he said quietly. "I thought I was saving them, taking them in and giving them a home. But the truth is, they saved me." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of Henry's words. "It's amazing how animals can do that." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, watching as Bear and Pumpkin chased each other through the grass. For the first time in years, Henry felt at peace. He realized that the life he had built, though unexpected, was a good one. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Bear, Pumpkin, and now even Michael. Before Michael left, he turned to Henry and said, "You should come visit us sometime. Mom would love to see you." Henry hesitated for a moment, but then he nodded. "Maybe I will." As Michael drove away, Henry turned back to Bear and Pumpkin, who were waiting for him at the porch steps. "Well, you too," he said with a smile. "Looks like we've got some family to reconnect with." That night, as Henry sat on the porch with Bear resting at his feet and Pumpkin curled up on his lap, he thought about how far he had come. Life had a funny way of surprising you, he realized. Just when he thought he had nothing left to give, Bear and Pumpkin had shown up and changed everything. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Henry whispered softly, "Thank you." And though Bear and Pumpkin couldn't speak, Henry swore they understood, because in their quiet, loyal way, they had said "you're welcome" all along. The days turned into weeks, and Henry's connection with Bear and Pumpkin grew even deeper. It wasn't just about their presence anymore. It was about the rhythm they brought to his days. Every morning, Henry would wake up to the sound of Bear's soft paws patting across the wooden floor, followed by Pumpkin's melodic purring as she leapt up onto his bed. One particularly crisp morning, Henry noticed something peculiar. Bear had taken to wandering toward the edge of the property, near an old maple tree that Henry hadn't paid much attention to in years. Every day, without fail, Bear would trot out there and sit beneath the sprawling branches, as if waiting for something. "Now what's got your attention out there, boy?" Henry muttered one morning as he followed Bear. Pumpkin padded after him, curious as always. When Henry reached the maple tree, he noticed something strange. An old wooden sign buried halfway in the earth, its edges weathered and worn. Henry knelt down, brushing the dirt away to reveal the faded letters etched into the wood. It read, "Margaret's Garden." Henry froze, his breath catching in his throat. This was the spot where his late wife had started her first garden. Over the years, it had become overgrown, the flowers choked out by weeds, and Henry had let it slip from his memory. Too painful to confront. Yet Bear had found it. Somehow, the dog had been drawn to it, as if sensing its importance. Henry sat back, staring at the sign. "How'd you know, Bear?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Bear looked at him with those kind, understanding eyes, as if he carried the answer Henry didn't know he was looking for. Pumpkin mewed softly and began to circle the area, her little paws brushing against the overgrown soil. Henry ran a hand through his graying hair, a wave of emotion washing over him. "Maybe it's time we fix this up," he said aloud, though it felt more like a promise than a thought. Over the following days, Henry threw himself into the task. He cleared out the weeds, tilled the soil, and planted new flowers: sunflowers, lavender, daisies, and roses. It was hard work, but it felt like therapy. Bear lay nearby, watching him carefully, while Pumpkin darted in and out of the garden, chasing butterflies and leaping through the grass. Henry couldn't help but feel Margaret's presence there. Every time he dug into the soil, he remembered how she had once worked tirelessly to nurture her little patch of earth, coaxing life out of the ground. And now Henry was doing the same, bringing life back to something he had let slip away. One evening, as Henry sat in a rocking chair by the porch, he looked out at the newly restored garden. The flowers were in full bloom, their colors radiant in the fading sunlight. Bear lay by his side, his tail wagging lazily, while Pumpkin stretched out on Henry's lap, purring contentedly. "You know," Henry said softly, "I think Margaret would have liked this." Bear lifted his head, as if acknowledging Henry's words, while Pumpkin gave a little sigh of satisfaction. For the first time in years, Henry felt a sense of closure. It wasn't that the pain of losing Margaret had disappeared. It never would. But something about the garden's rebirth made him feel closer to her, as if she were still a part of the world he lived in, just in a different way. The neighbors noticed the change, too. People began stopping by the farm more often, not out of pity, but because they saw something beautiful unfolding. The overgrown property now had life, a vibrant garden, a happy farmer, and two loyal companions who had brought it all together. One day, Henry received a letter in the mail. It was from a local gardening club, inviting him to join their upcoming community garden event. Henry chuckled as he held the letter in his hands. "Well, would you look at that?" he said to Bear and Pumpkin. "Looks like they think I'm some kind of gardener." Bear barked softly, and Pumpkin tilted her head, as if they were both encouraging him to go. Henry hesitated. For so long, he had avoided other people, content to stay isolated on his farm. But Bear and Pumpkin had taught him something important. Life was meant to be shared, to be lived fully, and maybe it was time to open himself up to the world again. "All right, you too," Henry said, slipping the letter into his pocket. "Looks like we're going to a garden event." When the day of the event arrived, Henry brought a small bouquet of flowers from Margaret's garden. He felt nervous as he stepped into the community center, Bear at his side and Pumpkin safely tucked in a carrier. People turned to look, some with smiles, others with curiosity. "Well, I'll be," one woman said, walking over to Henry. "You must be Henry." Henry nodded, his hand resting on Bear's head. "That's me. I heard about what you've done with your garden. It's beautiful work," the woman said warmly. "And these must be your helpers." Henry grinned. Couldn't have done it without them. The day turned out to be better than Henry could have imagined. He met other gardeners who shared tips and stories, many of whom marveled at the tale of Bear and Pumpkin, the dog and cat who had changed everything. By the time Henry returned home that evening, he felt lighter, as if a weight he didn't know he carried had finally lifted. As the sun set over the farm, Henry stood by Margaret's garden, looking out at the vibrant flowers swaying gently in the breeze. Bear and Pumpkin were at his side, as always. "You know," Henry said quietly, "I used to think I was all alone. But you too. You showed me how wrong I was." Bear leaned against Henry's leg, his tail wagging gently, while Pumpkin rubbed against his ankle with a soft purr. Henry smiled, tears glistening in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Henry knew he was no longer the man he used to be. His life was fuller, his heart was lighter, and his home was no longer just a place to exist. It was a place to live, to love, and to grow.